Coca-Cola, I swear to God. I tend to like to start my sets by offending as many people as possible, early as possible. I figure it's only way up after that, so. This was called Yellow Lines. Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me a car parking space. Lend me 12 foot of beautiful clean pavement, unpicked by meters. Oh, those fucking meters. Unsullied by that urgent yellow ushering you on. Nothing to see. Move on. Move on. Can't park here. That double stripe who follows you past house. A never-ending house. Till a gap appears. Only to be an unmarked garage. Where the pavement empties into the street. And untidy handwriting taunts you. Access constantly required. You jumped up, little prick! Access constantly required! Fuck off and don't park here, cunt! I believe is what you mean. And a way to be greeted by such words would leave me feeling cleaner. Not a shadow of a doubt that the sign was from a person. Someone you could seek out and ask them about their movements, their back and forth brigade that requires constant access to this rotten garage stage. Did you write that sign? Yeah? Constant access? Yeah? Constant access to what? The garage. What's in there? A fucking ambulance? Friends, Romans, countrymen, fetch me an ambulance, for the fight I picked with that jumped up little prick hasn't fared too well, and I'll be looking for a parking space a little further, I can tell. Bruised face and bruised ego from taking on that sign. Should have kept on driving past those endless yellow lines. Thank you very much. Okay, you seem to enjoy that, so it's a good sign if I swear and people clap. So, if you like any of my poems, I'm on Twitter, Olly Watson Poet, or SoundCloud, Olly Watson Poets. If you don't, you can still be my friend on it. It's called Humpty Dumpty. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. Because he was an immigrant. And worse than that, he was an illegal immigrant. He'd been injured whilst trying to climb the very wall the king had put there to keep his kind out. So there was no hope for Humpty. No compassion or goodwill as he lay there, broken in pieces, questioning the fates, his own gods, that were different in name to the king's, but in so many ways familiar. When found, he was not treated with the kindness and compassion that his God and the king's God and every other God then before had always preached. Rather, he was suspected, diluted, conscripted to a message, to an idea of himself and those who just happened to be where he was from, and like similar food, and speak in a similar tongue, and dress in a particular way, a message, an idea that added unfair layers to a shell that could seem hard to those who didn't know him, but in truth was fragile, brittle. The layers that were pinned to him like targets made him out to be a monster, a devil, a fiend without remorse, not the kind-hearted optometrist he really was, with 2 children and a plump wife, and an overly critical mother-in-law, who spent the days complaining at each and every detail of the attic room he had converted for her at much cost to his already troublesome back. The night he came home to find them all lying dead in thick pools yellow yoke. Shells smashed beneath the footfalls of those who opposed his free-range views. He'd run. He still hadn't had time to cry. He was chased and harried day after day by the authorities, men who looked like him and ate the same food as him and dressed in a similar way and shared a tongue and in some cases had grown up with him in the small hamlet in which he had spent his whole life. His jailers or captors or saviours, he wasn't sure, indifferently typed out this tale. Several weeks after he had taken his great fall, when he reached the part about his family, he noticed the typing had stopped. He repeated their names, the name of his wife, his little boy, only just walking, his daughter, forever plaiting and replaiting his thinning hair, which he had kept long just for her. He repeated them a second time, including the name of his mother-in-law. When the keys stayed still, he asked what the problem was. His jailer, or captor, or saviour, he wasn't sure, he was sat across from him on the splintered desk, looked up briefly, their eyes meeting for the first time. "It's not relevant," he said. Humpty was kept in a camp at the very edge of the king's borders, with only the wall close by for comfort. And his body's healed, his shells setting crooked, aching intolerably as the winter came and went again, without any word as to what he should do next. He waited, he walked, he thought. He didn't write letters like some of the other inmates, or captives, or guests. He wasn't sure. And he had no one to write to. And he spent little time with them, because although they spoke his tongue and ate what he ate and dressed in a similar way and prayed to the same gods, they were still strangers, as foreign to him as any of the king's men. On the 293rd day of his sentence, detention, foreign adventure, he wasn't sure. He left the cot he shared with 3 others, 8 lonely hours each, and headed for a gap in the thick wire fencing. He'd spotted it 3 weeks earlier. It stood out starkly, an anomaly amongst the cruel caging that only offered those inside 4 simple right angles and no hope of progression. He had watched the gap intently for several weeks, noting the heavily worn path that led to it, the fact that it faced the wall, and the blank stares of the guards, soldiers, guides, he wasn't sure, gave to anyone who stepped upon it. He looked up at the soldiers, the men, the robots, he wasn't sure, as he stepped onto the path on the 293rd day of his time in the King's Land, and wondered briefly if these blank-faced men, somehow not seeing him or not registering or ignoring him, he wasn't sure, had families of their own, possibly a plump wife, 2 baying children, who would jump on them as they walked through the door, desperate to tell of their day and ask of their father for his tales. Tales of the foreign fiends he fought day on day to keep them safe. He wondered what they might eat, what the name of their god was, and if they had ever thought of climbing a wall. Humpty's thoughts carried him along the well-worn path and out through the heavy wire fencing, which had been cut back neatly and folded over upon itself so that there was no danger of snagging one's clothing. At the foot of the wall he stopped and looked up. He prayed for a time, thought of his wife, that picture of her he'd always loved, of her unpacking a box in their first home, young and slim, a bandana holding up her thick black curls. He thought of his son and his daughter, the day they used to spend in the small garden in summertime, when the evenings held off to way past their bedtime, but he couldn't bring himself to take them inside and pack them off the bed. He even thought of his mother-in-law, the day of his wedding, when she had cornered him into the late evening, clouded with white wine and spritzers, and told him he was a good man, like her dead husband in many ways. Then had kissed him, thanked him. He looked up at the wall again, this time stealing one last breath. Humpty Dumpty climbed up and sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. Thank you. Good evening once and for all. It's called I Asked Death If He Was Lonely. I asked Death if he was lonely, and he replied with muffled cry, sometimes. When the wind is howling and the night is cold, I often think I might be getting old. Too old to weave the threads of life into the scarf or shroud that lies across that bolted corridor between here and there and evermore. Too old to sing those hallowed songs suckered on the rights and wrongs of glories past and fates anew, misted in the cold wind's hue. Too old to keep the look of death from affecting each and every breath. Brittle to those tears of woe cried by lover, friend and foe. Too old to carry sickle clear of man's belief, impression, fear. And as mud clings to my rotting hem, I think I've had enough of men. Enough of seeing drifting skin bottled like a deathly ring, and nothing knowing what's to come, that my race is simply never run. If that's so, why are you here? I asked Death as he held me near. I'm here because your breath is gone, whittled down to faded song. I'm here because you need a guide to see you through, stand at your side. But don't you feel the tears I cry for the questions of the when and why? For like them all, I fear to die. I fear that man up in the sky. Tears are naught but little lakes, filling up the world he makes, and questions seem to come and go like gardens in the winter snow. But you said you're feeling old. You hate the wind, the rain, the cold. You said you've had enough of men, so maybe then... What? Maybe your time has come. Yeah, it's your race is over, your race is run. Maybe then release yourself and take my place upon the shelf. Death looked at me agog, his face a little thin. Do you mean? I mean, he'd recognise me. He'd never let me in. Why not? You're just an instrument that he put upon the earth. You're kind and level-headed, and you know how much each life is worth. You've worked hard to get where you are. You've put enough time in. I have, Death said, as he looked at me, and I looked straight at him. But then the light that held his eyes for a moment, like the stars, faded to the mottled black of unrepentant scars. I can't go. You take my place. There's still so many left to die. And he looked at me, and I looked at him. Looked him deep within his eyes. I'll take your place if you take mine. You have to promise me one thing. Tell him it wasn't personal, it was nothing to do with him. You can't, he said. It wouldn't be fair. You down here and me up there. You can't imagine what it's like to see the end of every life, to hold a child to your breast before laying them down to rest. You can't imagine how it feels to walk across those killing fields where every face and every soul is calling out to be taken home. I couldn't give that all to you. No matter if you think I'm through. It's my task and mine alone, and it's time for me to take you home. But what if I don't want to go? If I'm not ready to see his home? I want to stay, I want to know. To be the one that takes them home. And from his hood he looked at me, and I looked at him, and we both could see I would stay, and he would leave. Okay, Death said. I promise so. I promise that I'll let him know that you stayed so that I could go. He'll know you made a sacrifice so I could end this lonely life. Good, I said, and Death replied, just one more thing. I'm not sure it's right. Can I take your name inside? It's just, I've never had a family, and now I'm you and you and me. Well, I gave Death my name, and he gave me a cloak, a little worn around the throat. And I led him up the stony path, a little hard to make out in the dark. And I patted him upon the back and wished him all the best of luck. He turned to me for one final time, and I saw the tears well in his eyes. You're sure, he asked, and sure to leave? No, I said, But let's wait and see. And so he turned and he took my place in the gentle hands of heaven's grace, leaving me to carry forth, to walk the world, to walk the earth. Thanks very much.